So I'm delighted to be here this morning, and even more pleased that I've been given the opportunity to speak about specific learner groups. As we all know, a person's life chances are too often predicated on their background and geography. Those who've spent time in care, are estranged from their family, or who are carers are far less likely to attend higher education than their peers, and those that do continue to face challenges during their education and post-graduation. To be effective in widening participation, we need to understand the experiences and needs of different groups, but we also need to recognise it shouldn't be a zero-sum game. Improving the opportunities for some people needn't reduce them for others. Admissions and student support processes that facilitate access to those who spent time in care can potentially work better for those whose disability may have impacted on their educational attainment. When teaching staff are aware of the impact of estrangement on their learners, they'll also be better placed to understand and acknowledge the different experiences of students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds or those who return to education as mature learners. A staff population and curriculum that reflects the diversity of the wider environment benefits all learners, regardless of their particular background. And so today, I want to argue that the lessons we've learned from a focus on care experienced students can and should be applied to others. I'll describe recent changes in Scotland before considering implications for other groups, such as Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities. I'll argue that whilst it's fruitful to consider the needs of different groups, they're not homogenous, and we can avoid assumptions and improve support by consciously taking an intersectional approach, something already mentioned this morning. Finally, I'll conclude by suggesting some practical questions that we can ask ourselves to make a positive difference. So to use Scotland as a case study, there's been impressive progress in relation to care experienced young people, but there's still much to do. As in the rest of the UK, outcomes for those who spent time in care remain poor. Care leavers are more vulnerable to homelessness and interaction with the criminal justice system, for example. Who Cares Scotland estimates that half of the adult prison population in Scotland has had experience of care, as have 30 to 50% of those who are homeless. Their educational outcomes also remain behind their peers. In 2017-18, 44% of those who'd spent a full year in care left school at the age of 15 or 16, compared with 11% of all school leavers. In that same year, just 12% of care experienced school leavers left with at least one qualification at level 3 for England and Wales, or SCQF level 6 in Scotland. So that's 12% in comparison to 62% of all school leavers. There were also significantly higher rates of exclusion. So care experienced young people are 8 times more likely to be excluded, and those who've had more placement moves are even more at risk. And Scottish Government data suggests around 5% of care leavers go directly from school to university in Scotland, compared with around 40% of all school leavers. There's been a raft of policy and activity in Scotland to better support care experienced people, both in general and specifically in relation to widening access to higher education. In February last year, the Care Review published the results of their root and branch review of the care system. Its findings and 80 plus recommendations have been dubbed the Promise and are now being taken forward with the aim to transform how Scotland cares for children and families. An oversight board was established last month to ensure that that promise is kept as the implementation phase gets underway. The provisions of the Children and Young People Scotland Act 2014 saw considerable changes in the responsibilities of local authorities and other partners towards looked after and previously looked after children. And this came into force in April 2015. Among those entitlements are that looked after children over the age of 16 can request support from local authorities up to the age of 26. The Act also placed the concept of corporate parenting onto a statutory basis in Scotland, with all post-16 education bodies included in that list of corporate parents. As such, all colleges and universities have a legal responsibility to be systematic and proactive in their efforts to meet the needs of local young people, local looked after and care experienced people. They must publish and prepare a corporate parent plan, collaborate with other corporate parents and provide information to ministers on their actions. And one great example of corporate parenting in action I want to highlight is the Hub for Success in Edinburgh, which brings together 5 universities, 2 colleges and the City of Edinburgh Council. The Hub was established to support the educational progress of people of any age with experience of care and provides individual tailored information and advice on routes into learning, as well as offering bespoke support. The Hub provides training to partners to better equip staff to respond to the needs and unique circumstances of care experienced learners. Scotland's Commission for Widening Access focused further attention on higher education for those with care experience. Its recommendations, published in 2016, and have led to the introduction of the Care Experience Bursary, which provides a non-income assessed bursary of £8,100 per year, rather than the standard student loan. The bursary was initially for those under 26, in line with the 2014 Act, but the age cap was lifted a couple of years ago in recognition of the fact that many care experienced students are only in a position to return to learning when they're older. The Commission also recommended the introduction of a guaranteed offer from Scotland's universities, which has now been introduced. If care experienced applicants meet the minimum entry requirements for a course, they are guaranteed the offer of a place. There are necessary caveats around professional requirements, auditions and so on, but it's a huge step forward. In addition, the sectors work together to develop a shared definition of care experience, and there are regional forums which facilitate collaborative work between institutions, schools, local authorities and third sector organisations. The Scottish Funding Council has developed a national ambition for care experienced students, which aims to see no difference in outcomes between care experienced and non-care experienced students by 2030. It's an ambitious target that needs to address both underrepresentation and progression as people begin their courses of study. I'm sure many presentations today will highlight fantastic institutional practice around outreach and support, and I wouldn't want to claim Strathclyde had any particular authority in this regard, but I do want to touch on some of the things that we've done institutionally. So since 2014, all of our work around care experience has been branded Strathclyde Cares, and we've slowly developed our suite of policies and activities with the aim of providing wraparound support within a whole institution approach. Our contextual offer policy has been in place since that time. So applicants from schools with low progression to higher education, who are resident in areas experiencing multiple deprivation, or those with experience of care are given offers at a lower entry rate than the standard offer. These are at the minimum entry rate deemed necessary to succeed, with the rate for each programme published online and in our prospectuses. Our named contact for care experienced applicants and students provides bespoke advice and guidance through the application process and beyond, liaising with academic departments and support services where necessary. The development of that personal relationship has been crucial in many instances in getting people into their degree programmes. Our Strathclyde Cares Committee meets regularly and brings together students with experience of care with representatives from across the institution, and that committee monitors our progress and determines our priorities. We provide 365 days a year accommodation, priority for financial support, and a guaranteed interview for ambassador roles within the recruitment and widening access teams. We also offer financial support at point of graduation to really celebrate and recognise success, so students can use that money to make sure they have the photography package and a gown at the graduation ceremony, or to attend their graduation ball and buy an outfit for it. We've included care experience within our equality impact assessment process, and we've recently published guidance on supporting care experienced staff and students as part of our updated equality, diversity and inclusion policy. We give priority to care experienced students with the international opportunities we've developed within widening participation. So, for example, I very selflessly took a group of care experienced, estranged and student carers for a 10-day study programme in 2019 to the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, which was transformational for many of the students and something that we hope to pick up again post-pandemic. One of the most impactful projects I think we undertake is our Strathclyde Cares Mentoring, which is where we match a trained volunteer member of staff with our incoming care experienced students to provide support throughout their degree. Our mentors are there to be what we've dubbed pushy corporate parents. So they encourage our students to take advantage of additional opportunities, advocate for them, and help them navigate university processes. We match people with somebody from a different faculty so they understand that it's not academic support, it's really a friendly face or there to provide pastoral support. And the response to that programme was overwhelming when we first set it up. We didn't know how many volunteers we'd get, and our principal sent out an email to the university on the Friday asking for volunteers. On the Monday, we came back to 300 responses, and my team and I sat around thinking, oh, Strathclyde really does care. And a byproduct of that scheme, which we hadn't necessarily knew was coming, was that we've created this network of knowledgeable champions. So we have a whole group of staff members who are committed to supporting care experienced students, who understand their challenges and are cascading that information across the institution. Over that time period, we've seen a 161% increase in applicants from care experience backgrounds, a 217% increase in offers made to them, and a 218% increase in students registered. So institutionally, regionally, nationally, there has been a huge amount of work to better understand the challenges and provide support for care experienced students. There's been the will across the political spectrum and throughout the relevant sectors. Even so, progress is slow. And as my colleague Kenny McGee from the Centre for Excellence for Looked After Children in Scotland, or CELSIS, has pointed out, it's clear that Scotland isn't short of bold policy intentions and ambitious thinking to address the issues that care experienced young people have faced for many years. But to date, there's been a stubborn implementation gap between policy ambitions and consistent action and improvements in practice. So it's really important we never sit on our laurels or congratulate ourselves for policy that isn't necessarily being implemented. The disproportionate impact of COVID-19 has shone a spotlight on continuing, indeed escalating inequalities of particular importance in an education context. The pandemic has broadened the digital divide, particularly for vulnerable groups, and CELSIS has explored digital access for looked after young people and confirmed that digital exclusion has been exacerbated and intensified during COVID-19 for looked after young people. There's a lack of access to hardware, a lack of consistent, reliable broadband, and for some young people, significant gaps in their digital literacy or confidence. At Strathclyde, we were able to prioritise care experienced estranged students and student carers when allocating laptops and Wi-Fi grants, but that does little to support those who are still applying, and we're not sure if funding will be in place for that in the coming year when some form of blended learning is likely to continue. But we have learned a lot. We now know throughout the UK what is effective in supporting care experienced students, and it's vital we take that learning and apply it to ever more groups. Estranged students, for example, can be just as vulnerable as care experienced and face many of the same barriers, but don't have corporate parenting or local authority support. The work of Standalone has been tremendous in raising awareness of these issues, and in particular their pledge ensures that senior leaders champion the needs of those studying without family support. Within my own institution, we've expanded provision of name contact support, and we have a very broad institutional definition of care experience so that many are covered under that umbrella. Our student society has decided it wants to cover both care experienced and estranged students to offer social and peer support and advocacy. Likewise, with student carers, we have a named contact and a university committee that puts the student voice at the fore. We also have regular contact with our staff carers network, and from next academic year, we've expanded our contextual offers policy to give lower offers to those who have caring responsibilities. But there are other groups that we should be prioritising as well. And I don't want to presume to provide a definitive list, but just wanted to highlight a couple of examples. Just for those from the armed forces community, both veterans and early service leavers, as well as children from military families, deserve focus. The work of the Service Children's Progression Alliance, SKIP, has been particularly effective in raising the profile of this group. They run a network of hubs throughout the UK, and I would thoroughly recommend you find your nearest if you're not already involved. I was delighted that Strathclyde was one of 5 universities to sign the GTRSB in HE pledge at its launch in January this year, and that's in recognition of the barriers that people from Gypsy, Traveller, Roma, Showman and Bota communities continue to face. And they estimate that on any one time, there's just 200 members of that community in higher education within the UK. I'm aware there can be potentially group fatigue as it becomes increasingly difficult to persuade senior leaders to sign up for yet more pledges. It can even feel that different groups are being pitted against each other, competing for our attention while we decide which one's more worthy of support, while we struggle with limited resources and capacity. And this is taking place in an era when the needs of some groups are potentially being weaponised by bad faith actors in an attempt to diminish focus on others or even breed resentment. So as the Runnymede Trust have eloquently argued, for example, narratives around left behind white working class boys are rarely made by those who would take action to improve those conditions. The outcomes of white working class boys are held up against their working class peers from BME and migrant groups, rather than reflecting on how you could improve outcomes for all, or the significant achievement gap between working class children and those from more affluent backgrounds. It can be challenging to raise awareness and gain institutional support when there aren't statutory obligations like there are for care experience, or there isn't the opportunity to disclose via UCAS, when it's still necessary and it ultimately improves support for all. Often it can involve simple expansion. I say simple, I know there's resource implications, but looking at what you've got, what existing support is in place, and can that be adapted or expanded so the named contact seems to work really well. Can people take on that role for other groups? Often it's about working with a third sector organisation or taking action on a local, regional or national level, rather than just doing something as an organisation on their own. I realise this is sometimes easier to do in Scotland because we're a smaller group of institutions who work very closely, but I know there's lots of regional work taking place within England, for example. And I think it's important not to underestimate the importance of an organisation simply acknowledging and naming specific groups. It may be that you're at the very start of a journey in understanding challenges and putting support in place, but to see yourself recognised and reflected can be really empowering. So increasingly, I think we need to focus on student parents who've had a really difficult time during school closures and nursery closures, and simply acknowledging that fact, I think, can make a huge difference. It's also important to remember that these groups aren't separate. So some student parents are also care experienced. There are people from the armed forces community who are carers. They're also not homogenous, and we need to take care to remember that individuals within those groups might have very different experiences. An intersectional approach is helpful here. It's an increasingly ubiquitous term, but intersectionality was theorised more than 30 years ago by Kimberly Crenshaw to describe how class, race, gender and other characteristics intersect or overlap. To put it somewhat reductively, a young male Scottish Pakistani carer's lived experience, their needs and encounters with discrimination will be very different from a mature female white carer. This awareness will help us consider the different needs within a group and help focus on those who might be the most distanced from forms of privilege. My own research exploring the experience of trans, non-binary and gender diverse staff and students in Scotland highlighted the importance of considering protected characteristics alongside other identities. In fact, I would argue that gender diverse learners are another group for whom we should be providing tailored support, and that again, focus here would benefit a far wider cohort. We know that LGBT plus people, particularly trans learners, have a higher incidence of estrangement. So we can't really be offering appropriate support for all estranged learners if we don't understand the needs and experiences of trans and non-binary people in education, or the way in which factors such as race, gender or disability interplay with care experience and socioeconomic status. According to the UK Parliament's Trans Equality Report published in 2016, high levels of transphobia are experienced by individuals on a daily basis, and discrimination is part of daily life for trans people. Transphobic hate crimes have quadrupled over the past 5 years. And so it was within that context that myself and my colleague, Matson Lawrence, undertook a research project funded by the Scottish Funding Council that sought the views of gender diverse staff and students on their experiences in education. Our findings were stark. 86% of our participants had experienced barriers to their learning or work, which they directly attributed to their trans status or gender diversity. The biggest challenge concerned peer relationships with colleagues and fellow students, with many experiencing ignorance or hostility. Research participants often had very low expectations, and many felt unsafe or unwelcome within classroom and wider campus environments. 35% had withdrawn from their course before completion. Over half didn't know if their institution had a policy of specific support for them, and just under a quarter felt entirely unable to disclose their trans status to their institution under any circumstances. Our recommendations, which were incorporated by the SFC into outcome agreement guidance, included the provision of named contacts and the kind of support we've been talking about for care experienced students. So finally, I wanted to finish with some practical questions that I think can be useful when informing strategies and activities. So the first is, are you taking a whole institution approach, as advocated by Liz Thomas, amongst others? So is your widening participation and recruitment team talking to those undertaking equality and diversity work? Where you have relevant staff and student networks, for example, with caring responsibilities, or perhaps those who are parents, are they connected? Because often the fact you're a carer matters more than whether you're a staff member or a student within an organisation. Are you connecting with practitioners, connecting with researchers in your field to ensure that there's an evidence-informed approach, or that you're evaluating the activities that you undertake? I think another question to ask is, do you need to take a targeted approach? Are the needs of this group so specific, or is there such a level of underrepresentation that it's necessary? Or is it that you need to work on mainstream provision being more inclusive and understanding the needs of that specific group? Are there ways you can embed consideration across an organisation? So, for example, it's a legal duty to conduct equality impact assessments as a public body within Scotland. So the inclusion of care experience, socioeconomic disadvantage and reflection on other underrepresented groups is a really powerful way of making the whole organisation consider those needs when undertaking new activities, when developing a new policy or practice. The provision of a named contact is really effective, but there's also ways in which you can cascade that awareness and responsibility. So I think our mentoring scheme is a really good example of creating a network of champions. And then finally, I would say, are you placing people with lived experience at the centre of activities and plans? So are you ensuring that you're taking an empowering strengths-based approach rather than focusing on deficits? And I know that's a massively hypocritical thing to say, having just spent 20, 25 minutes talking about poor outcomes and underrepresentation. It's important to know that, but we also need to think about what people bring to an organisation and how we're missing out if we don't have that representation. And so I think it's really important we move away from a deficit approach and talk about strengths. So I'll end there. Thank you very much for listening to me. I hope the rest of the day is productive and enjoyable, and I'll be along later for the panel. So thank you very much.